Philippe d'Orléans shocked 17th-century Europe by living as a woman in a man's body, wearing silk gowns to state dinners, painting his face with makeup, kissing male lovers openly at Versailles, and teaching desperate young men from starving families that survival sometimes meant submitting to a prince's intimate desires in exchange for protection and bread. He became known as Monsieur Madame across France, a royal scandal who could wear any dress except the crown itself. Philippe was born in 1640 as the younger brother to Louis XIV, and from the moment he entered the world, his fate was sealed by a single fact: he would never be king. His mother, Anne of Austria, understood that younger brothers of kings were dangerous, historically speaking. They raised armies, started civil wars, challenged succession. So she made a deliberate choice to neutralize that threat before it could ever develop. She dressed Philippe in girls' clothing, surrounded him with women instead of military tutors, and actively encouraged feminine behavior in every possible way. The logic was brutal but effective. A son who wore dresses and moved like a court lady could never command the masculine respect needed to threaten the throne. What Anne didn't anticipate was that Philippe wouldn't just tolerate this conditioning but would genuinely embrace it. By the time he was 10 years old, he was selecting his own gowns with the enthusiasm of someone who actually cared about fabric quality and embroidery patterns. He spent hours with court ladies learning how to apply cosmetics, how to arrange wigs, how to move with the particular grace that heavy skirts required. His brother Louis watched this transformation with a mix of amusement and satisfaction because the strategy was working perfectly. A feminized brother was a safe brother, and their relationship settled into a comfortable pattern where Louis held all the power and Philippe existed as an elaborate decoration who would never challenge that arrangement. The sexual dimension of Philippe's femininity emerged during adolescence, and it shocked even the jaded court of Versailles. He didn't just prefer male company in some abstract way. He actively pursued sexual relationships with men while presenting himself as the feminine partner in those encounters. His first serious affair was with a young courtier from an impoverished noble family, and the dynamic was clear to everyone watching. The young man needed money and position desperately, and Philippe was offering both in exchange for romantic and sexual companionship. They appeared together at court functions with Philippe wearing gowns that matched or complemented what his lover wore, and Philippe touched him openly during these events, displaying possessive affection that mimicked how wives behaved with husbands rather than how male friends interacted with each other. Foreign ambassadors started sending reports back to their governments describing something they had no framework for understanding. The French king's brother was living as a woman despite being anatomically male, and he was conducting romantic affairs with men in plain view of the entire court. Philippe's reputation spread across Europe not as a man who engaged in sodomy, which while condemned was at least conceptually understood, but as someone who had somehow become female in everything except biological fact. The scandal grew with each passing year as Philippe pushed his presentation further, wearing more elaborate gowns, applying heavier makeup, and making no attempt whatsoever to hide his sexual relationships with the young men who cycled through his favor. Louis XIV allowed all of this because Philippe's behavior served a useful purpose. It made him completely unsuitable for any position of real power, which meant the king could grant him titles and wealth without worrying those resources might be used against the throne. When Philippe married Henrietta of England in 1661, everyone involved understood this was a political arrangement that had nothing to do with love or desire. Henrietta arrived at the French court expecting to marry a prince and instead found herself wed to someone who competed with her for the same men's attention and who spent more time and money on his wardrobe than she did on hers. The marriage existed primarily to produce heirs and strengthen diplomatic ties between France and England, and both spouses understood they were free to pursue their actual romantic interests elsewhere as long as they fulfilled their official duties. Henrietta took lovers at court while Philippe continued his affairs with men, and they maintained a cordial relationship based on shared understanding that their marriage was a job rather than a romance. It was during these years that Philippe acquired the nickname Monsieur Madame, a label that combined his official title as the king's brother with the feminine form to capture the essential contradiction of his existence. He was legally and technically Monsieur, the highest-ranking prince of the blood after the king himself, but everyone at court related to him as Madam because that's what he actually was in every meaningful social interaction. Philippe embraced the nickname rather than fighting it because it acknowledged a truth that everyone could see. He lived as a woman regardless of what his anatomy said about him. He appeared at state dinners in silk gowns that cost more than most nobles spent on clothing in a year, with his face painted in the thick white powder and rouge that aristocratic women used to create the fashionable appearance of porcelain delicacy. He wore elaborate wigs that he changed multiple times per day to match different outfits, and he carried fans that he used not just as accessories but as communication devices, deploying the complex fan language that court ladies used to signal interest or dismissal without speaking directly. The young men who became Philippe's lovers came almost exclusively from noble families that had fallen on hard economic times. These were men who had the birth and education to attend Versailles but who lacked the money to maintain themselves at court without patronage, and Philippe offered a straightforward transaction: sexual availability and romantic companionship in exchange for financial support, court positions, expensive gifts, and the valuable social capital that came from being visibly favored by the king's brother. Some of these men approached the arrangement with pragmatic calculation, viewing intimacy with Philippe as unpleasant but lucrative work that paid better than their available alternatives. Others discovered that the reality was less disturbing than they'd feared, and a few even developed what seemed like genuine affection for a prince whose feminine vulnerability made him easier to relate to than the aggressively masculine nobles who also traded in sexual patronage. Philippe conducted these affairs with theatrical intensity, treating each new lover as though this was the great romantic passion of his life. He wrote love poetry, commissioned portraits of his favorites, arranged elaborate private dinners with musicians and expensive wine, and generally performed all the courtship behaviors that men typically directed toward women but which he inverted to position himself as the pursuing party, showering attention on male objects of desire. His apartments at the Palais Royal became famous for evening gatherings where Philippe and his current lover would host select courtiers for entertainment that made their sexual relationship obvious to everyone present. Philippe would appear in spectacular gowns while his lover dressed in masculine finery, and they would interact in ways that created visual and behavioral pairings similar to how married couples presented themselves at social events. What made these relationships particularly complex was that Philippe also positioned himself as a teacher, conducting what he called lessons in feminine comportment where he instructed his lovers in the arts of graceful movement, careful speech, and refined presentation. These educational sessions naturally created opportunities for physical contact as Philippe demonstrated proper posture or corrected his students' positioning, and they frequently transitioned from instruction into intimacy in ways that blurred the line between mentorship and seduction. Servants who worked in Philippe's private apartments reported that he insisted on occupying the receptive role during sex and became genuinely upset when lovers attempted to reverse the dynamic or suggested he should take the penetrative position. This wasn't just performance or preference but something deeper, an insistence on being treated as female even in the most private moments that suggested his gender identity was fundamental to how he understood himself rather than an act he could set aside when convenient. The foreign ambassadors who came to Versailles to conduct official business with Louis XIV found themselves unexpectedly dealing with Philippe at state dinners and diplomatic receptions, and their reports home reveal just how shocking his presentation was to people who arrived with no preparation for what they would encounter. The Spanish ambassador wrote multiple dispatches describing his profound discomfort at being seated next to Philippe during a formal banquet where the king's brother repeatedly touched his arm, leaned close enough that the ambassador could smell his heavy perfume, and made comments about the ambassador's appearance that would have been forward coming from a court lady and were completely incomprehensible coming from a prince. The ambassador clearly understood that Philippe was making sexual advances toward him, but he couldn't process why this was happening during an official diplomatic function or how he was supposed to respond to a member of the French royal family behaving like a courtesan pursuing a client. When Philippe's first wife died in 1670, the English diplomats who came to offer condolences found him receiving visitors while dressed in elaborate mourning clothes that included heavy black veils and excessive jewelry. Philippe wept theatrically during these meetings and spoke at length about his personal grief in ways that made it impossible to conduct the political conversations about succession and alliance that the death of an English princess should have prompted. The diplomats left these encounters feeling they had attended a performance rather than a diplomatic consultation, and their reports described Philippe as someone so absorbed in performing his own emotional drama that he couldn't engage with the practical matters that needed attention. His second marriage in 1671 was arranged to strengthen French connections to German territories, and the bride who arrived was a practical woman named Elizabeth Charlotte who had been thoroughly briefed about what kind of husband she was getting. She approached the marriage as political duty and expected nothing in terms of romantic attention or fidelity, but even her low expectations couldn't fully prepare her for the reality of living with someone who spent more on his wardrobe than she spent on hers, who maintained a constant rotation of young male lovers who came and went from his apartments at all hours, and who treated these lovers with more visible tenderness and consideration than he showed his own wife. Elizabeth Charlotte wrote letters to relatives in Germany describing the surreal household she found herself managing, where her husband's primary identity was as a court lady rather than as a prince, and where she often felt like an unnecessary addition to a life that was already complete without her. The German diplomats who visited Philippe after this marriage found him even more flamboyant than his reputation suggested. He received them while wearing gowns that deliberately matched or competed with what his new wife wore, creating bizarre situations where both spouses appeared dressed as women and the visitors had to figure out which one was actually the prince. Philippe's behavior during these diplomatic meetings included the same inappropriate flirtation he directed at other male visitors, and the Germans sent back reports describing someone who violated every expectation about how royal princes should conduct themselves with foreign representatives. The Dutch were perhaps most shocked by Philippe because their Calvinist representatives arrived with rigid moral frameworks that made them view his femininity and open same-sex relationships as active violations of divine law rather than merely unusual social practices. Philippe seemed to enjoy scandalizing these particular visitors, appearing in his most theatrical presentations and conducting himself with exaggerated feminine mannerisms that were clearly designed to provoke maximum horror from people whose religious beliefs made them see his existence as fundamentally wrong. Philippe's typical day at Versailles revolved around the elaborate process of transforming himself from private male body into public feminine presentation, a transformation that required several hours and involved numerous servants who had learned to treat him as they would a court lady rather than a prince. He woke late in the morning and began with bathing and careful shaving to remove any facial hair that might undermine his feminine appearance. Servants then helped him into multiple layers of undergarments including corsets that created the fashionable silhouette by compressing his waist and lifting his chest, followed by petticoats that added volume to his skirts, and finally the gown itself, which was custom-tailored to accommodate his male anatomy while creating the visual impression of a female body underneath. The wig selection took considerable time because Philippe owned dozens of elaborate pieces in different styles and colors, and he chose each day's wig to complement his planned outfit and the social events he would attend. The application of cosmetics was perhaps the most time-consuming part of the routine, taking nearly an hour as servants applied white powder to his face to create the fashionable pale complexion, rouge to his cheeks and lips for color, and various preparations around his eyes to make them appear larger and more feminine. Philippe supervised this process closely and had servants redo any applications that didn't meet his exacting standards. Once his face was complete, he spent additional time selecting jewelry from his extensive collection, choosing pieces that would catch light and draw attention while also coordinating with his outfit's colors and style. The public appearances that followed this preparation were performances where Philippe deployed decades of practiced skill in feminine presentation. He had mastered the particular way of walking that heavy gowns required, a gliding motion that kept the upper body stable while the skirts swayed with each step. His hand gestures were deliberately graceful and economical, suggesting delicacy rather than masculine strength, and he used his fan as both accessory and communication tool, understanding the complex fan language that court ladies employed to signal interest, rejection, or irony without speaking directly. His voice was naturally high, but he modulated it into even more feminine registers, speaking with the breathy quality and careful word choice that aristocratic women used to signal refinement. The evening parties Philippe hosted at the Palais Royal became legendary in Paris as events where people could witness his most elaborate feminine presentations while enjoying excellent food, live music, and the social networking opportunities that came from being included in the king's brother's inner circle. Philippe would circulate through these gatherings wearing whatever spectacular gown he had selected for the evening, engaging in multiple simultaneous conversations while remaining perfectly aware of every social dynamic in the room. His current lover would attend these events as his acknowledged companion, and they would interact in ways that made their relationship obvious, with Philippe touching the young man possessively and the young man playing the attentive masculine role in their pairing. The private lessons Philippe conducted after these public events involved teaching his lovers what he considered essential aspects of refined presentation. He showed them how to move with grace, how to modulate their voices for different social situations, how to use gesture and expression to communicate more than words alone could convey. These lessons naturally created opportunities for physical contact, as Philippe demonstrated by positioning his student's body with his hands or corrected posture by pressing against them from behind, and the romantic tension these interactions created would eventually transition into sexual intimacy that Philippe treated as the natural conclusion of their time together. The young men who participated in these lessons had complicated responses because Philippe genuinely believed he was sharing valuable knowledge while also using the educational framework to extract sexual compliance from men who needed his patronage too desperately to refuse. Philippe's entire life existed in the shadow of his brother Louis XIV's absolute power, and no amount of feminine performance or scandalous behavior could change the fundamental reality that he was born into royalty but permanently excluded from actual rule. Louis tolerated Philippe's eccentricities partly because of genuine fraternal affection and partly because a feminized brother posed no political threat, but that tolerance had clear limits that became obvious whenever Philippe showed signs of wanting real authority beyond his ceremonial titles. Early in Louis's reign, Philippe participated in military campaigns and actually distinguished himself in battle, demonstrating tactical skill and personal courage that surprised everyone who had dismissed him as purely ornamental. But Louis responded to Philippe's military success not with pride but with alarm, recognizing that a brother with military reputation could become dangerous even if that brother wore dresses and kissed men. The king quietly ensured Philippe never received another significant military command after that one successful campaign, redirecting him firmly back toward courtly pursuits and social activities that kept him visible but powerless. This became the consistent pattern of their relationship. Philippe would occasionally attempt to engage with politics or administration, and Louis would gently but firmly push him back toward fashion, parties, and romantic affairs that posed no threat to royal authority. Philippe understood what was happening but had no ability to resist because Louis held all the actual power, and their fraternal affection existed within this framework of absolute political inequality. Philippe fulfilled his dynastic duty by fathering children with both his wives despite his clear preference for male partners and his feminine identity. The children from his second marriage survived to adulthood and provided Louis with nieces and nephews who could be deployed in marriage alliances across Europe, but Philippe showed little interest in them beyond ensuring they received appropriate royal education. His wife essentially raised these children alone while Philippe continued his life of feminine presentation and affairs with young men, creating a family structure where the biological father was largely absent from any actual parenting. As Philippe aged into his 50s, his feminine presentation became increasingly incongruous because his body showed masculine aging that no amount of cosmetics could fully disguise. The contrast between the court lady persona he maintained and the physical reality of an aging male body created visible dissonance that made his performances less convincing even as he worked harder to maintain them. His lovers during these later years were increasingly young men decades his junior, and these age-disparate relationships revealed the power imbalance that had always existed but became impossible to ignore when a man in his 50s was pursuing sexual relationships with men in their teens and 20s. These young men accepted Philippe's advances almost entirely because they needed the financial support and court positions he could provide, and their willingness to submit to intimacy with an aging prince in women's clothing demonstrated how desperate their circumstances were and how valuable royal patronage remained even when it came attached to requirements many of them found disturbing. Philippe died in 1701 at age 60 after collapsing during an argument with Louis about marriage arrangements for one of his children. The stroke that killed him came suddenly, and he died within hours while his brother watched helplessly. His death eliminated Versailles' most persistent scandal but also removed someone who had served a useful political function by demonstrating through contrast what happened to royal men who failed to perform proper masculinity. Louis mourned his brother genuinely while also feeling relief that he no longer had to manage Philippe's behavior or explain to foreign governments why the French royal family included someone who lived as a woman despite being born male. Philippe left behind a reputation that remained controversial for centuries as people tried to understand whether he was a victim of deliberate childhood conditioning, a pioneer of gender nonconformity who deserves recognition for living authentically, or simply someone born into a body that didn't match his internal sense of self who did the best he could within the limited options his society offered. The French court after his death continued tolerating various forms of sexual and social nonconformity, but nothing ever approached the spectacular performance Philippe had maintained for 4 decades. Monsieur Madame became a historical curiosity, a story about the prince who wore dresses to state dinners and kissed male lovers at Versailles while all of Europe watched in fascinated horror, the man who could wear any dress except the crown itself.